Hi friends, welcome to this latest episode of the Nationalist View, and we have with us a very special guest, Mr. Salih Hudayar, Foreign and Security Minister of East Turkistan Government in Exile. Mr. Hudayar, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So let me first tell you a little bit about the East Turkestan issue, and Mr. Hudayar will correct me if I go wrong anywhere factually. So East Turkestan basically is referred to by the Chinese state as Xinjiang, which means new frontier. It's actually a historically distinct Turkic homeland that has been under Chinese occupation since 1949. So broadly, if I try to put it in the layman's language, China has occupied East Turkestan since 1949 and it renamed it basically Xinjiang. And after that, what it has done, uh, so Beijing, after incorporating the region as Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, while steadily eroding its real autonomy through demographic engineering, political repression, and cultural and religious suppression. And in recent years, the control has intensified into a vast system of surveillance, mass detentions, and coercive policies targeting Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. It has drawn widespread international concern, but not as much as it should have. It is in this context that the East Turkestani people continue their struggle for rights, identity, and self-determination. And East Turkestan government in exile plays a significant role in that. Now, a little bit about the East Turkestan government in exile. So, this government is a democratically elected body representing the interests of East Turkestan and its people. It was established in Washington, D.C. in 2004 and it has representatives in 13 countries. So, Mr. Udyar, we want to talk about, what is happening in East Turkestan and related issues. But my first question is that you recently, did a tweet that in context of Nicolas Maduro's deportation from Venezuela to USA. The way he was picked up and then brought to USA. So that's a basically, whether it was right or wrong, that's a different story altogether. But you tweeted that uh, you are looking forward to Xi Jinping also getting the same treatment, who is an enabler. Basically, you use the word enabler of, this authoritarian regime. So, what do you mean? If you can, break down this tweet a little bit and uh, why you brought in basically, Xi Jinping in this picture and what is the context of that?
Well, as you know, this operation happened literally several hours after Maduro was visiting or meeting with a high-level Chinese delegation. Um, and this is not the many. This is the visits of many. This is not the first visit he's had. I mean, he's actually has a really deep relationship with China, and I think this is one of the main reasons why the United States decided to do what it did is because of that relationship that Venezuela has with China, and that is a threat to the United States national security and interests. So they decided that we can't allow China to get a foothold or increase its foothold in Latin America, which is right there in America's backyard. So why I said that the same thing needs to happen to Xi Jinping is the fact that Xi Jinping is much more brutal of a dictator than Maduro. I mean, Maduro is like if we were to compare Xi Jinping and Maduro would be like a little baby, in the essence of his uh, activities and actions and crimes. But what has been enabling Maduro over the past several years, especially given the fact that there was mass protests by the Venezuelan people, they were against Maduro and his regime that he had set up there. They wanted more freedoms, but of course, wherever you see dictators, the first country that to support them is, of course, China. And that's, not unique to just Venezuela, but other places in the world. In Syria, for example, the Assad regime's main partners in this case was, China, and of course there was Russia as well. But China was like the financial backbone. Venezuela, in the case of Venezuela, China has been both the financial backbone, but also the security backbone. China has exported its security and surveillance apparatus and tools or expertise to Venezuela, in helping Venezuela crack down, or in helping Maduro crack down on the Venezuelan people, but also holding his power. And of course, the money is coming down from China. Tools are coming down from China. Um, China is buying up a lot of Venezuela's oils. And this is something that has been raised by President Trump. I mean, he didn't normally. You would see governments, giving some other form of, a more diplomatic reason why they went in. But President Trump, he put it quite bluntly: the Chinese were taking the oil, and we can't have that happen because China's a rival. So we decided to take action. It was mostly in control of resources, the critical resources that could potentially shape, the outcome of a conflict if it came into an actual physical conflict between the great powers. So the reason I said that is, again, there's both the humanitarian aspects of why we want the same thing to happen to Xi Jinping. I mean, Xi Jinping has been in power since 2013, and he's been engaging since he got the power, he has been engaging in genocide. He unleashed the Belt and Road Initiative. That was his project, which is a tool, really more so than an infrastructure project. It is more a tool of projecting China's influence, and facilitating the logistical networks to where China can expand further, not just into Central Asia, but essentially across the world. And so they're engaging in a form of neo-colonialism. So this is why, Xi Jinping needs to be held accountable. But as I just mentioned as well, because of the resources, and the fact that, uh, Xi Jinping and China played a vital role in keeping the Maduro regime in power, despite the fact that the Venezuelan people were, largely opposed to it. They are their chief. They are essentially their chief enabler. And so that's the explanation of my tweet.
So, if you can give us a little brief, or if you can give us a brief overview of what is happening in East Turkestan right now, the ground situation. So we, often talk about it, but it'll be good to, do a recap of it. And how would you describe the scale and nature of repression, faced by the Uyghur people in East Turkestan?
So what's happening in East Turkestan is nothing less than, textbook colonialism, occupation, and genocide. So right now, though the fact that the Chinese government says, "Oh, there's no repression going on here," or that their propaganda that they like to put out is that Uyghurs are, happy. They're like they're the supposedly the happiest Muslims in the world, and that, they're uplifting them from poverty, etc. This is the euphemisms that the Chinese government uses to justify its campaign, to whitewash its crimes, really, saying that they're providing them with vocational training. So millions of our people, since 2014, were taken into the concentration camps, which the Chinese government euphemistically calls as vocational training centers or re-education camps. Um, since 2014 till 2019, this is according to the end of 2019. Again, this is not my statement, but the Chinese government's own white paper from September 2020. Every year, they were sending 1.29 million people to the concentration camps, or roughly 7.8 million people between that period. Then they say that, oh, many of these people of the camps graduated. So they claim that people, when they mean graduated, they finished their quote training and they got jobs. This was the excuse or the explanation that they provided. 3.5 million people, they said, they uplifted from poverty and gave them jobs, working in factories. So 3.5 million of our people were essentially enslaved in forced labor, because again, many of these people that are in these camps, they're not impoverished people. You have our wealthy people who have been stripped of everything. Like, we have a bunch of billionaires. Billionaires. We had several billionaires, hundreds of millionaires. All of their wealth, assets, everything was seized, and they were thrown into the camps and prisons. All of our intellectuals, even political leaders. Like, when I mean political leaders, not our political leaders, but even those political leaders that the collaborators, in our view, they're collaborators. Even the collaborators that collaborated with the CCP, many of them were accused of being so-called two-faced, or not loyal to the CCP, not loyal enough to the CCP, and they were also thrown in. Um, you know, People from all walks of life, young and old, were thrown into these camps, extrajudicially. So the Chinese government, after international pressure was mounting, really 2020, 2021, after that, they began to claim that, they're no longer in the concentration camps or re-education. They graduated. Now they're working in factories, stating that 3.5 million of them were working in factories, and that they provided them with jobs and etc. 3.5 million of our own people, again, this is according to China's own statements, are essentially being used as forced labor, at the very least, if not slave labor. You have at least 1 million of our people who have been forcibly transferred out of East Turkestan into Chinese provinces for, again, forced labor. Um, According to testimonies by Chinese former Chinese police officials who actually transferred a lot of Uyghur prisoners, at least 500,000 Uyghur prisoners were transferred out of East Turkestan into prisons across China, where they were essentially, sit there to die. So our people are being killed every day, literally. Dozens, if not hundreds, of our people are dying every day, solely for their organs. So the organ uh, harvesting industry skyrocketed after the launch of the camps. In 2013, according to China's own data, there was about 6,000 or so organ transplants. And again, they call it voluntary, even though it's not voluntary, because most of the people that they get these organs are from political prisoners. Then the next year, in 2014, it skyrocketed over 50,000 organ transplants. Again, this is according to China's own data. Where is these organs coming from? Again, from the Uyghur and other Turkic prisoners. There are special lanes in East Turkestan at the airport that says for organ transplants only. China has been expanding. In fact, it's recently, in February of this year, it highlighted that it was going to expand, triple the number of organ transplant centers in East Turkestan by 2030. So this is not a hidden fact anymore. They're not trying to hide it. They're saying, we're doing this, and there's nothing you can do about it. This is the sad reality on that front. China's own judicial record shows that they have put over 578,000 Uyghurs. They have officially sentenced them from anywhere from 5 years to life in prison. And this is officially a third, over 33% of the total prisoner population, the legally or justified judicial prison population. It's over 33% of it, despite the fact that Uyghurs, according to China's own statistics, census, don't even make up um, uh, 2% of the total population in the PRC. We make up over 33% of their legally justified, prisoner population. Again, the reason why is most of the crimes that people are being sentenced for is for like crimes like separatism, terrorism, extremism, very vague. So, for example, for the Chinese, for me, they would call me all three of the categories. They charge me as all three of the categories. But for the Uyghurs, this is if you're a young person and you have even this much of facial hair, that's extremism or terrorism. It falls into whichever category they want. If you refuse to accept or that you are quote Chinese, if you say no, I'm not Chinese, I'm Uyghur, you'd be a separatist. If you were like, I believe Uyghurs should have their own state. You could even say, regardless of whether you're peaceful about it or not, even if you just the idea of that, immediately you're a terrorist. This is the type of vague things. People that have been imprisoned, they've been imprisoned for having ever traveled overseas, for having, contact with their relatives overseas. My own cousin, Mustafa, he was sentenced to over 20 years in prison. He was like 22 years old when they sentenced him. And that was in retaliation to the case that I had brought up before the ICC against China for genocide and crimes against humanity. They sentenced him to over 20 years for so-called separatism and terrorism, even though he's never been involved in anything like that. Just the fact that he was my cousin, just to send the signal to me, because initially they said, before they sentenced him, they said, withdraw your case. They had people calling me, telling me, withdraw your case, and maybe you can save Mustafa. And I refused. And then they sentenced him to that. I had relatives that died in the camps and prisons. 4 of them died that we were able to get information about. So this situation has not changed, despite the fact that it's now coming into the 12th year. And actually, next week, or on January 19th, it marks the 5th anniversary of when the United States officially recognized it as genocide and crimes against humanity. And other parliaments followed suit in Europe. They issued similar recognitions and designations. But despite this recognition, designation, and low-level condemnation, because nothing really has been done fundamentally to hold, Xi Jinping and the Chinese government accountable, they're still continuing genocide with impunity in 2026. At the current moment, millions of our people remain incarcerated, either imprisoned in the prisons, or in the forced labor factories. And again, the forced labor factories are just the around the concentration camps, the previous concentration camps. Because if you look at satellite imagery, what they did is they just started building industrial complexes near it. So essentially, they're still in the concentration camps. The people are still being held there, and they're being, moved to the industrial facilities right next to it during the day to work there as forced labor. So this is the situation. Our culture, our language, everything is being stripped. Right now, they're trying to imprison our people, saying that if you listen to Uyghur songs, right now we can't even listen to songs in our own language anymore, because now that's become a crime, to where they will imprison you if you listen to Uyghur songs now. So this is the level of oppression there is. They continue to round up our people. Those outside of the camp, their life is 24/7 surveilled. Every morning they'll force our people to come before the village, if they're in a village, before the village square, where they're forced to, attend a Chinese flag raising ceremony and swear oath and loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. Of course, what the Chinese don't realize is that this will only deepen the hatred our people have for the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state. So it's being counterproductive in that sense. But this is the way that they're doing it. And so when the opportunity comes, our people will gladly rise up. And so we're hoping that opportunity will come sooner than later.
So China has branded the East Turkestan government as a jihadi movement, and it has tried to equate it with kind of a political Islamist movement, and it is a jihadi or a terrorist cause, and especially a number of groups or narratives which probably might have been the Chinese proxies themselves. So they also kind of work in a way that discredits the East Turkestan movement. So how do you look at the attempts to discredit this movement? Who are behind these attempts, and which are the major players? Basically, if you can kind of underline also who are trying to discredit the East Turkestan movement, especially
Well,
which are the Chinese proxies.
this is actually China since the 1950s has been doing this. So in 1949, they occupied us. In 1955, in because our people were and our leaders at that time, they're like, we're done with, thank you, but we can take you from here. We want you to get out. We want to be independent. China was like, no, I'll give you autonomy. Even the autonomy, our people rejected, our leaders rejected. To where in 1957, China unleashed a so-called anti-rightist campaign, and they began to demonize our movement, our independence movement, as a local nationalist and counter-revolutionary movement. And so this was the term that they used throughout the 1950s, 60s, starting in the late 70s to 80s. It was they described it as counter-revolutionary activities. Then in the 1980s, late 1980s, really after 1988 is when they started to describe it as so-called separatism. Prior to that, they didn't refer to it as such. They were like, "Oh, these are local nationalists, counter-revolutionaries, etc." Then after 9/11, they're like, "Oh, we have now an entire excuse to call this terrorism because we are predominantly Muslim population," and so that's been the framework that they've been using to demonize. Of course, you have countries that have helped China in this. China's main proxies in helping frame our movement as a so-called, interlinked with global jihad or Islamist movement has been Pakistan. The Taliban have played a vital role in this as well, and countries like Turkey. So actually, in 1996, um, our independence movement was gaining traction, gaining some attention in the international community. This is after the fall of the Soviet Union and the independence of the Central Asian countries. So our leaders who had went into exile in Central Asia, they began to, continue pushing for independence. There was a lot of protests, civil disobedience, mass civil disobedience, and some low level engagements like conflict, shootouts, and between Chinese security forces and actual Uyghur nationalist militants, as well as attacks on critical infrastructure like oil pipelines, railways, etc. This was the attacks, the slow level insurgency that was taking shape. So in response to that, China issues document number 7, or CCP document number 7, officially CCP Central Committee Politburo document number 7 from 1996. Seventh document from 1996. They issued it in March of 1996, March 19th of 1996, in which they issued it. They laid down a 10-point directive to the various Communist Party branches, the Chinese ministries, including public security, defense, intelligence agencies, urging them to use all means necessary to prevent the internationalization of the East Turkestan problem. Specifically, Directive 8 called for co-opting other countries like Turkey, like the Central Asian republics, to crush our independence movement. It called for creating propaganda and using infiltration, dividing our diaspora, our organizations, winning over most of it to China's side, and then eliminating and marginalizing and fighting against those who are a small number who refuse to give up on independence. So this is what China has been doing over the past. So in 1997, while tens immediately after this, like 2 weeks after this, China launches the Strike Hard campaign, and in April of 1996, against so-called national separatism. So they're arresting tens of thousands of people across East Turkestan. In fact, I was 4 years old. They raided our home as well. I arrested one of my uncles for allegedly reading a separatist book, as they called it, and being a part of a so-called separatist organization. So that was happening in 1997. But at the same time, what's interesting is if you know the Pakistani journalist, there's a prominent Pakistani journalist who interviewed Osama bin Laden several times. I forgot what his name was. I think something Mirza. And he also interviewed Zawahiri. So after Zawahiri died, he published a article, I believe it was in the New York Times, or the Washington Post, one of the two, in which he highlighted that he had one of the interesting meetings that he had with Zawahiri back in the day. And he said one of those meetings, I was in my bag, I was carrying a Xinjiang Airlines bag. And so Zawahiri pointed to it and he's like, "Oh, that's the same thing, same airlines that I used to travel to China." And he apparently visited East Turkestan. So it's like, oh, what's Al Qaeda doing, visiting, and why is the Chinese allowing this? This is where the interesting thing happens. And apparently this happened in 1997. So in late 1997, China releases a handful of Uyghurs, which many Uyghurs previously, we had suspected that they were Chinese government informants. While they're cracking down on nationalism, they release these so-called Islamists into initially from prison. They travel initially to Beijing, and then from Beijing they go to Pakistan, where they are greeted by the Pakistan Islamic Party, the party that has a cooperation agreement with the Chinese Communist Party. Like none of this is a conspiracy. It's all publicly available data. So what happens is they're greeted by the Pakistani Islamic Party, and then there they create the Islamic Party, the East Turkestan Islamic Party, as they call it. And they're in opposition to our independence movement. These handful of Uyghurs led by Hassan Mahsum began opposing our independence movement, saying nationalism is against the principles of Islam. God is not going to ask if you fought for East Turkestan. God is going to ask what you did for the Muslim Ummah. And he said the Uyghur people's goal should be to liberate all Muslims from infidels all across the world, not just focusing on China. Our goal should be to establish an Islamic caliphate. And this was the necessary propaganda that they needed. In fact, in 1997, the UK Telegraph wrote at that time that our leaders in Central Asia, inside East Turkestan, rejected Islamic fundamentalism, but China was increasingly trying to tie our independence movement to Islamic fundamentalism, and saying that it seems to be a deliberate attempt to connect this and to undermine our independence movement before it becomes well known. And that's exactly the strategy that China employed. In Central Asia, all of our major leaders, they were assassinated. The Central Asian governments cracked down on our independence movement. And by 1998, our independence movement was finished in Central Asia. In 1998, uh, the so-called ETIP went off into Afghanistan, where they literally months after the Taliban, Pakistani intelligence, and Chinese intelligence held a meeting, a trilateral meeting in Kabul in February of 1998, and where Mullah Omar promised that he would not allow anyone to use Afghanistan as a base to harm China. 3 months later, they embed the small group, the handful of ETIP operatives led by Hassan Mahsoum, which we believe these are a Chinese false flag created by Chinese intelligence in coordination with Pakistani intelligence. And there they connect them with none other than Osama bin Laden. And there he makes a video. And in his video, in his propaganda video, Hassan Mahsoum says, we did this because, again, God is going to ask us what we did for the Ummah. Especially after 9/11, China launched its own war on terror, you could say, taking advantage of it, and using the global war on terror, they launched their genocidal campaign, the precursor of it, under the guise of fighting terrorism. So immediately, what they did is 2 months after 9/11, this is where the so-called ETIM narrative comes. Prior to that, you will never find any single mention by anyone of a so-called ETIM, because there was no entity calling itself the ETIM. The closest thing to that would be the so-called East Turkistan Islamic Party that was created in China's all-weather ally, Pakistan. But all the other groups were nationalists. So China needed to frame our independence movement as, a terrorist movement. So what did it do? It fabricated the East Turkestan Islamic movement, and saying that everyone who advocates or uses the term East Turkestan or calls for a state in East Turkestan, they are ETIM, or they are the East Turkestan Islamic movement. And so they were able to convince the US and other countries to recognize, to list the ETIM as a terrorist group for other geopolitical concessions. In the case of the US, it was no vetoing US invasion of Iraq. And they wanted all the groups to be listed, but the US only accepted that vague designation because, one, they know the group doesn't exist. If they need to backtrack it later on, they can be like, okay, the group doesn't exist. This is why I'm backtracking. And that's essentially what the US did in 2020. And so to the international community, they stated, the ETIM is a terrorist Islamic movement, etc. To our people, after the US and others recognized it as such, they said the US and the international community, they recognized your independence movement as a terrorist movement. So this has been kept alive. And the reason they kept the ETIP alive for so long is because they need a justification. They have to point to something that is verifiable to, show that they have an actual threat, a terrorist threat or an Islamist threat, etc. So they kept them alive in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Then after the Syrian conflict, sent them off into Syria. Then this is when China was like, oh, I have a real terrorism threat. Thousands of Uyghurs are fleeing off into Syria to join jihad there. And of course, this was done in coordination between Turkish and Chinese intelligence. And that became the fundamental basis for that. So they carried out a couple of false flags, indiscriminate bombings inside East Turkestan, um, and then blamed it on Uyghurs. And immediately you had the ETIP releasing videos saying, "Oh, we claim responsibility. We're the ones who did it." And China's like, "See, I have this threat." So this is the basis on which they rolled out their genocide. And to this day, the Chinese government officially describes this campaign of genocide as, counterterrorism, and the official name, they describe it as the People's War Against Terrorism. That's their official euphemism for their ongoing genocidal campaign.
So one last question. Israel has recently recognized Somaliland as an independent nation. So what would it take for the world to recognize, East Turkestan as an independent nation? What kind of possibilities you see in the near future about East Turkestan getting recognized as an independent nation by at least, to begin with some of the countries in the world? So how do you look at it?
Well, right now, to get recognized as an independent nation, we'd have to first recover our independence. That is going to take, a considerable amount of actions and support from the international community. The geopolitical situation has to, be ready for that. There has to be, the climate needs to be ready for that. And right now, we're edging towards that. The international communities slowly realizing that China is a threat to their own, to global security and to the sovereignty and security of multiple nations. At the current moment, the first pre-step is to recognize the fact that East Turkestan is an occupied country. So that needs to be the first step, to recognize that East Turkestan is an occupied country, that it was historically East Turkestan, the fact that, China is occupying it and colonizing it. This is going to be the first step. Then the second step is to push for decolonization, and elevate our right to self-determination, supporting our right to decolonization and external self-determination in accordance with international law. So governments need to support us in that sense, by raising and voicing their support for our self-determination and independence, in the same way that China is doing for, in the case of Palestine. China is like, oh, Palestine has the right to be governed by Palestinians. China supports the Palestinian self-determination, etc. China supports, the Palestinian people's right to resistance, including armed resistance against, citing international law, saying against colonial domination, etc., etc. Um, the United States, India, other powers, whether that's Japan, even Russia, others, they need to raise our issue from that anti-colonial lens as well, recognizing us as an occupied country, supporting our right to decolonization and external self-determination, and supporting our right to resist against colonial domination, in accordance with international law, of course. That is going to be the first key steps that need to be taken. And then, obviously, after these steps are taken, after there is some proactive movement within East Turkestan, not just inside the diaspora, and once we are able to actually liberate some part of our country, and when we are able to declare our independence, this is when the international community needs to be ready to recognize our independence and recognize us as a fully independent country. The U.S. could, by recognizing us as an occupied country, they would recognize the fact that we were historically an independent nation. So we have been actively pushing for this recognition across the world, from virtually every government that we meet with. We've been asking the same things, because talking about our issue from the human rights lens does nothing for us. It actually benefits China, because when you ignore the root of the question, the real issue, and again, it helps China prevent the internationalization of the East Turkestan problem, because when it's done under the framework of human rights, what does China say? Oh, you have human rights violations too. you're abusing human rights in this way, that way. Or they'll say, this is my internal affairs. Under international law, this is my internal affairs. You have no reason to get involved in my internal affairs. Or it'll create propaganda saying that Uyghurs are the happiest Muslims in the world, that there's no more human rights, than the Uyghurs have more human rights than the majority of people across the world, etc. All these lies. This is the way China frames it. And it only buys China time, because when you frame it as human rights violations, there's no urgency to stop that. They're like, oh, we feel sorry for them, we condemn them, and this is how it is spent. This is how they spent 70 years. The past 76 years, this is how the international community has responded. And look at the reality that it has produced. Has our human rights improved in any way? No. Our human rights have been eroded more and more every single year. We went from over 95% of the population in 1949 to right now, combined population of Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples is about 57, 58%. The Chinese went from less than 2, 3% to over 40%. This is the reality. And if this continues, in the next decade or two, the Chinese colonists will become the dominant ethnic group, like the overwhelmingly dominant ethnic group inside East Turkestan. And we will become marginalized. We will become the so-called ethnic minority that they, referred to us as. In fact, that was their goal. By labeling us as an ethnic minority in the 1950s and 60s, the purpose was, this is our goal. We want to reduce them to a small minority in their own homeland. And they are successfully, for the large part, working towards that goal. This is why, for us, again, the human rights perspective, it doesn't benefit us. It benefits China in buying time, because there's no real action to it. You're not compelled to do anything against it, other than issue, express statements of, oh, we're concerned, we condemn it, etc. Condemnation has not, to date, saved even one Uyghur from death. Expressing concern hasn't done anything. We're in the 12th. We're coming into the 12th year of official genocide, 76th year of occupation, and our situation has been getting worse and worse and worse by year. But at the same time, our actual issue, the root of the problem, the genocide, which is Chinese colonization and occupation, the denial of our right to national self-determination, the denial of our right to decolonization, is being eroded. So this is why, for us, this must be the prerequisite. The world needs to shift from just human rights to focusing on the root of the issue, and then there's both a legal and moral obligation, both for the international community to act against it, but they also have the right to, support. We have the right to ask for their support, and they have the right and obligation, actually, under international law, according to various UN resolutions. States must support decolonization, and they must support independence movements. They will have that obligation. Then, when we can legally resist, the Chinese won't be able to demonize us as terrorists or whatever excuses that it uses. Just how the Chinese diplomats at the UN, their ambassador to the UN, stated that the Palestinian people have a right to resist colonial domination and occupation, including armed resistance. This is something that the Chinese themselves cited. The East Turkistani people have the same rights under that same international law to resist against Chinese colonial domination and Chinese occupation. This is the way it needs to be framed internationally. Then governments can act without, quote, violating China's so-called internal affairs. Then the real issue will be addressed. And at the same time, again, East Turkestan is the cornerstone of China's Belt and Road Initiative. China's expansionist project. East Turkestan is what connects China to South Asia, Central Asia, and ultimately to the Middle East and Europe. So an independent East Turkestan would resolve the problems of not just East Turkestan, but the problems that many countries have, like so-called border issues that they have with China. Like India would no longer have a border problem with China whatsoever, because if East Turkestan becomes independent, Tibet becomes independent, India never shares a border with China, and historically, India has never shared a border with China. Aksai Chin, it would be returned back to India. Other territories that China tried to seize, it would be returned back to India. The territories that China tried to annex into other from other neighboring countries, or the disputes that they're trying to claim territories of other countries, none of that would exist. It would be best for the security of not just and survival of Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples, but for the security and long-term survival of the countries that border East Turkestan. So this is why it's in their fundamental interest to support and recognize East Turkestan as an occupied country and support our right to national self-determination and decolonization.
Thank you, Mr. Hudayar, for sharing such deep insights. And East Turkestan, the continuously developing story, and it's a movement which is progressively unfolding. We'll continue to track it, and we hope to have Mr. Hudayar back soon again on our podcast. And thank you so much for taking time out from your busy schedule and sharing all these inputs and your analysis. Thank you so much, Mr. Hudayar.
Thank you for having me.